Thanks for inviting us in. This is the Delphi Debrief here on WTHR+. Day 15 of the Delphi murders trial saw the defense team for Richard Allen bring witnesses to discredit the prison confessions that jurors heard last week. In a moment, you'll hear from our legal analyst, Katie Jackson-Lindsay. But first, we want to get right out to Delphi with our senior investigative reporter, Bob Siegel, and Samantha Johnson. So Bob and Samantha, today started off talking about Richard Allen's mental state, didn't it?
It did. That was really the focus. Want to welcome Samantha joining us on the debrief. You've been covering the trial and all the pretrial hearings from the very beginning, so it's wonderful to have you here with us tonight.
Well, happy to be here, and I think especially in these days as we inch closer to what's expected to be the end of this trial, we're hearing more important information come from the defense team, and that was certainly the case today.
It was. Just to let you know again where we are, we're directly across the street behind us is the Carroll County Courthouse. And inside today, some really important testimony. And like Scott just mentioned, you know, last week we had these jailhouse phone calls from Richard Allen, which were devastating for the jury to hear these confessions in Richard Allen's own voice, saying over and over again that he killed Abby and Libby. That was last week. This week, the defense has been working very hard to turn the page and to help the jury understand why those incriminating statements were made. So we'll talk about that in a moment. First, let's get you up to speed on who the witnesses were for today on day 15. We started with Dr. Polly Westcott. She is a neuropsychologist, years of experience dealing with inmates. She was the first witness today. Then Max Baker. We've heard from Max before. He is an intern for the defense team who's been working on this case now for 2 years, basically since Brad Rosie and Andrew Baldwin were assigned to the case. Then we heard from 2 family members of Richard Allen, Jamie Jones, Richard Allen's sister, and Brittany Zapanta, that is Richard Allen's daughter. And it's the first time we've heard from the 2 of them throughout this entire case. We heard from Shelby Hicks. She was at the Monon High Bridge and the trails around there on the afternoon of the murders, and she testified today. Then we heard again from Steve Mullen. I believe it was his 5th or 6th time being called as a witness, this time by the defense again. He is a former Delphi police chief. More importantly, he has been serving as the investigator for the Carroll County Prosecutor's Office in this case. And lastly, Brad Weber, he lives right next to the crime scene. Some fascinating testimony from him today, and we will talk about him in a moment.
Yeah, and what fascinated me about this list of witnesses we heard from today, the first few really documented what Richard Allen's life looked like inside of prison, right? We got a little bit more insight of what that looked like. The next 2, though, were his life outside of prison and his life long before we even had this conversation. And then the last 2, sort of towards the end of our list here, felt like a little bit of, okay, let's talk about this case on a much broader scale. So we kind of have a little bit different parts of this case, getting to know more of the defense's arguments in this case too. But this morning, you were saying earlier, was perhaps some of the most telling information we've heard yet so far.
I think for the defense, it was probably the most important witness to take the stand so far. So let's talk about Dr. Westcott and her testimony. She started today telling jurors that she met with Richard Allen last year inside prison to conduct a detailed series of psychological exams on him. Based on those exams and reviewing what she said were countless videos and phone calls and prison reports and medical reports and handwriting samples, Dr. Westcott wrote a 127-page report about Richard Allen's mental state. And we want to show you what her conclusions were. She said Richard Allen has a very long history of mental health disorders going back to when he was a child. The doctor referred to him as a fragile egg when he arrived at the Westville Correctional Facility. She said Richard Allen was not faking or exaggerating his mental health issues while incarcerated, and she said that he showed a clear decline in his mental and physical health within, she said, about 4 months of arriving at the prison. Dr. Westcott said Allen showed a significant slowing of his thinking around the time of his confessions. Based on her analysis, she said Richard Allen suffered from major depressive disorder around the time of his confessions. And she said that disorder combined with high levels of stress caused him to suffer psychosis during the time period when he made his incriminating statements. So those conclusions, crucial for the defense, because it really offsets and counters the most damaging evidence that we have heard so far against Richard Allen, again, which were those confessions to his psychologist in prison, to his mother, to his wife, and confessions that the jury heard directly in his own voice. This helps kind of set the scene for the jury about why those incriminating statements were made.
And we've heard during jury selection, we've heard so far in this trial that a lot of these jurors were concerned about hearing some of these things, about seeing some of these things, whether it be photos, videos, audios that we've heard too. And again, this morning, they were shown some pretty, I would use the word, graphic videos from inside that prison.
Yeah, we'll talk about those videos in just a second. I want to show you a few of the other specific comments that this neuropsychologist said about Richard Allen, because she testified for well over an hour today. She explained more about that dependent personality disorder. And she said essentially that a person can't function, make decisions, exist on their own when they have this disorder. And she said that Richard Allen in prison had these constant feelings of abandonment and rejection, and in her words, basically fall apart, that he fell apart when his wife and his mother were not physically there. So she talked about that disorder that he was diagnosed with. Again, she referred to him as a fragile egg by the time he even got to the prison, that even before that he had a long history, and that he was very fragile before he got there, made much worse once he was in prison. A direct quote from her to the jury: no indication of faking or any type of exaggeration. We heard earlier that some of the prison guards and even the warden, and at times even the psychologist inside the prison who saw him almost every day, said at times it seemed that he was really making this stuff up, that he was pretending to be crazy. Today, Dr. Westcott said, no, I didn't see that during the time he made these confessions. It was genuine. He wasn't faking. There was not exaggeration there. And then she talked about delirium, which she said at times she clearly saw that he was showing signs of delirium. She said someone who is in that state doesn't know who they are, where they are, the time of day, and specifically she said they have no accurate perception of the world around them. And I thought that was a particularly important description because it showed, again, his state of mind, according to this neuropsychologist, his state of mind, no accurate perception of the world around him. That would make it hard for someone to be making accurate statements about what they were saying.
Yeah, and for her to specifically reference Richard Allen's mother and wife, so many of those phone calls that we have heard, that the jurors have heard, have been to his mother and to his wife. So
Yes.
if he is truly dependent on these people, that's certainly played out in the phone calls that we've heard.
A couple of other interesting things here from this psychologist. She actually compared, and she has experience in looking at handwriting samples, and she compared a note that Richard Allen wrote to the prison very, very early on during his incarceration in November of 2022, complaining about conditions there. She compared that with a note that he wrote that eventually went to the warden confessing in April of 2023, and she pointed out that there were major differences in the handwriting, that his November 2022 note, there was punctuation, there was sentence structure that it made, it flowed and it seemed much more coherent and put together compared to the confession that he wrote out in 2023 that lacked a lot of those things. And she said that shows a serious and significant mental decline. She also, well, I want to point out that the state pushed back during cross-examination on this witness, and they were critical of the neuropsychologist for not incorporating the confessions of Dr. Walla, who was the prison psychologist who saw him almost every day, and pointed out that Dr. Walla did not determine that there was delirium or psychosis right around the time that he made his confessions. And how did she explain that? And she said, and they also pointed out that she didn't even include his detailed confession to Dr. Walla, where he explained all the things that he did on the day of the murder and how he killed the girls and all those things that were in his confession. And she said that Dr. Walla actually did describe in her notes signs of delirium and psychosis, even though she found that he was not experiencing those things at that time. And she pointed out that Dr. Walla, in her description of what Richard Allen said during the confession to her, that was a narrative, that there were no quotes. And Dr. Westcott said that it's very different getting what looks like a really coherent description of committing these murders from a psychologist versus what he may have actually said on that day to her, and the fact that his speech may not have necessarily been that coherent. And she said on that day she reviewed video which showed, in her opinion, that he was really suffering from mental health problems. So very important testimony today from Dr. Westcott, and we know that that is in response to some powerful video.
Powerful video, and like we said a second ago, the jurors had been concerned that they were going to be seeing some of these. We heard that weeks ago during jury selection. But again, you talked about how crucial today was for the defense. This video that the jurors saw, and I know you were in the courtroom, Bob, the courtroom itself did not see some of these videos. It was only meant to play for the jurors, but you heard from a witness who described some pretty graphic detail.
Yeah, today, to support the testimony of Dr. Westcott, jurors got to see 2 videos that show Richard Allen inside his prison cell. And again, we didn't see those videos. The video screen in the courtroom was angled and turned so only the jury could see it. But we were told by a witness that the video showed Allen eating his own feces and banging his head against the wall of his cell. Some jurors clearly found the videos difficult to watch. I saw one wincing and repeatedly looking away from the video screen. Again, this was an effort by the defense to try to convince the jury that Richard Allen's mental health was so deteriorated in prison that it drove him to make false confessions. And with the jury present, important to point out, prosecutor Nick McLeland, he got into a heated exchange with the defense team. He accused the defense of showing only the very worst images of Allen in prison to try to get sympathy from the jury and to turn Richard Allen into the victim. The defense countered that by saying that they showed video of Allen inside his prison cell that would show the truth. And of course, the video, the 2 long videos, the compilation of videos that were shown in court today, that comes after Saturday, where the jury got to see 15 different videos that took about 2 hours for them to look at. And again, only the jury got to see that video, but that was showing Richard Allen outside of his cell, showing him being showered, getting a haircut, getting medical treatment, getting tased in one video. Some of the jurors showed some signs of concern looking at that video on Saturday. Again, all of this by the defense to try and show the conditions that Richard Allen was in while he was inside Westville Correctional Facility.
And can I ask how much video today? How long were those videos? Do you remember?
So the videos, again, these were compressed. One of the first video was 5 hours, compressed way down Brad Rosie, who was walking the jury through these videos, he would, with the judge's permission, fast forward a couple minutes at a time. Clearly there were certain parts of the video that he really wanted the jury to see. The second video was shorter. That was from a 2-hour time frame. The first one was from a time period in April. I believe the second one was from a time period in May. Again, both time periods that Richard Allen made confessions about the murders of Abby and Libby. So the defense was trying to say, look, the same time that he was making confessions, he was in a deep state of psychosis and not doing well, and wanting the jury to actually see what he looked like, how he was acting during that time. And again, today specifically during that first video, some of the jurors looked horrified at what they were seeing. We were able to see their faces. We weren't able to see the video, but if the defense was trying to make an impact on this jury, today I think they did that.
And keep in mind, this was all in the first few hours on a Monday morning, right?
Yes.
Back from the Sunday break, back in court this morning. And this was a lot to break down. It was a lot to process. It was a lot for the defense to talk about. It was a lot for these jurors to take in too. So I think now's a good time, Scott, to kind of talk this over with our legal expert, to kind of break down what all of this means for us going forward.
All right, very good. We'll do just that. Thank you so much, Sam. We'll get back to you and Bob in a moment. Katie Jackson-Lindsay is a former deputy prosecutor, a criminal defense attorney. She's been with us every day of this trial, breaking things down. So let's talk about Dr. Polly Westcott, the psychologist who detailed in this 127-page report this long history after examining Richard Allen, that he had a long history of mental health disorder. He called him a fragile egg, not faking his mental health issues. This is much different testimony than what we heard from Dr. Walla last week.
That's so impactful and it's so significant because this is the first time in the trial that we heard a fact presented by the state or a set of facts, and it has been directly refuted with completely contradictory evidence by the defense. And so this is that scenario where the jury is advised in jury instructions that they're going to hear from witnesses, and it's their responsibility to judge the credibility of these witnesses. They can decide what to believe, what not to believe. They can decide to believe part of a witness's testimony, some of it, or all of it, or none of it, right? And so this is a scenario where they have to put that to the test because they now have completely conflicting testimony, and they're going to have to judge the credibility of the state's expert on these particular facts versus the defense's expert. So this is a big point in this trial.
All right, so let me ask you, the jury obviously wincing and having reactions to seeing this video that our reporters were unable to see because, again, they turned the TV toward the jury so only the jury could see it. What impact is this having on the jurors to see these videos, to see what Richard Allen's state of mind is, to see him physically in his jail cell after hearing the testimony from Dr. Westcott?
Well, it could have a range of impacts. So it's obviously causing some sort of physical reaction because we heard what Sam and Bob described. One would hope that it's having the intended impact of looking at these alleged confessions not in a capsule, but in their complete environment in which they were made. You know, the defense has alleged all along that he was suffering from significant mental health issues, that there were delusions, and the state has put witnesses on that's completely said that's not true. And so now the jury has an opportunity to not just hear these confessions, but they've had an opportunity to see the full context in which they were made, which is important. And in fact, it's so important that I believe this is evidence that should have come from the state, because the state should have wanted the jury to see the full picture of how these alleged confessions were made. And so you have the intended impact of now they can understand a little bit better in context why Richard Allen may have been saying such things if they weren't true. But there's also just that normal human reaction. So this is similar to the jury looking at those crime scene photos. One of the jurors in particular, we saw in the notes from today, one of the jurors that had a significant emotional reaction that was obvious to people in the gallery was the same juror that had a significant emotional reaction to those crime scene photos.
Let's remind our viewers about Richard Allen. He's presumed innocent. He is in a prison with convicted felons, right? And he's on suicide watch. The lights are on constantly. He's hearing comments from other offenders that are in the prison. So can you describe, what to our viewers, the kind of conditions that were there when Richard Allen was being held waiting for his trial?
Well, what we've learned about those conditions is that those are conditions that are unacceptable even for a convicted person. We've heard evidence such as he was competing with cockroaches and ants for his food. The lights were on 24/7. He was being threatened. He was being watched 24/7. He didn't always have running water.
Right.
He was made to sit in his own feces. That's not even acceptable conditions for someone who has been convicted of a crime. And so it has really put a spotlight on prison conditions in that prison. But another thing that's really significant is that under normal circumstances, a jury wouldn't even be allowed to know that a person was in jail awaiting trial. That's why defendants wear plain clothes to court. That's why they don't wear jail uniforms, because there's studies that show that does something to the psychology of the jury in determining guilt or innocence. And so this is significant in that regard as well, because the issue of Richard Allen being detained pre-trial has only come into play and into the purview of this jury because of these alleged confessions.
So at the end of the day, before we get it back out to Sam and Bob, at the end of the day, these jurors are having to decide which psychologist that has been monitoring Richard Allen in jail do they believe, right?
Exactly. So they're going to have to weigh the credibility of each of those people. We know that each time each of those witnesses were put on the stand, you heard a bunch of information about their experience, and we learned about, their full resume and all the training that they've had. And so now the jury has to compare those one to the other, and even make some credibility calls based on other things that they might not normally have to consider. For example, the doctor from the Department of Correction no longer works there.
Dr. Walla, right?
Right, and there's a mystery surrounding that because the state objected to the defense going into that, versus you have this reputable Dr. Westcott who testified that she has testified for prosecutors and for defense attorneys.
Right.
So I would think that would give her a little more credibility in that regard. So it's a tough job, but they've been instructed on how to go about doing it, and it's clear to me that they're keeping an open mind based on their questions.
All right, let's get back to Bob and Sam now, because two of the other witnesses that we heard from today, that the jury heard from, two family members of Richard Allen, right?
Yeah, that's right. We had his sister and his daughter today. This was the first time we had heard from them. So again, really impactful testimony coming from Richard Allen's attorneys today and their defense team. I do want to start with his sister, Jamie Jones. I think we have some video we can play for you here of the two walking into the courthouse today. Jamie, the sister, is in the orange sweater, the orange cardigan you see here, and his daughter, Brittany, is just behind her in the gray long-sleeve shirt. So let me start with Jamie today, his sister. She told us in court today that Richard Allen is about 5 years older, so she's the younger sister. She said they lived together growing up as they were children. And the defense was very straightforward and honest today. The defense, as they were questioning Jamie, said, let's just get right to it. And she asked the following questions. I'm going to put them up here on your screen. She said, did Richard Allen ever molest you? In which Jamie responded, no, he did not. They asked again, did Richard Allen ever touch you? In which Jamie responded, no, he did not. The defense asked her at the end of that questioning, do you love him? Do you love your brother Richard Allen? In which she said yes. Next up, immediately after that, we heard from Richard Allen's daughter, Brittany. She came up on the stand. She said, Richard Allen is my father. She said she lived at home, of course, growing up as a teenager until she went to school years later. And it was similar line of questioning that we heard from the defense to his sister and his daughter. Similar questions, including, did your father ever molest you? In which she said no. Do you love your father? Of course, she said yes. The defense asked her, would you lie for him? She said no. Seemed pretty straightforward answers, again, directly from Richard Allen's family. But then there was some more questioning, and they brought up photos. This was the state, brought up photos of Richard Allen, they say, from before the girls went missing, before February 2017. And they asked, you know, is this a fair representation of what your dad looked like at the time? What about this one? What about this one? What about this one? And she said, well, yeah. But the defense said, do you know when these were taken? What about this one? Do you know when this one was taken? And she couldn't really say, right? These were from years ago. But again, the state said, is this a fair representation of what your father looked like at the time the girls went missing? To which she nodded.
Yes.
I think there was a little confusion. She was like, well, yeah, that's what my dad looked like, but again, I don't know when those photos were taken.
Right. And let's talk about why, specifically, why those questions about, you know, did your brother ever molest you? And that ties in directly to the testimony that Dr. Walla gave about the confession that Richard Allen made to her while in prison. And during that confession, or some of the statements that he had made to Dr. Walla, he had talked about the fact that he had molested some of his family members and mentioned names of some of his family members. And, oh, I'm so sorry that, you know, I molested this person, I molested that person. So hearing his daughter and hearing his sister specifically say, no, that never happened. Again, that ties into the testimony that we heard from Dr. Westcott today, saying that during this time he would have made statements that very well may have been just detached from reality. And so by calling Richard Allen's daughter and sister to say, no, those things didn't happen, that were part of the things that he confessed to while in prison, it kind of underscores the point that he was saying things at that time that didn't actually happen.
Yeah, and one of the biggest things I was watching for was the demeanor between the two, right? Yeah. When we saw Richard Allen sitting at the defense table and then his own daughter take the stand in his defense, I was really curious what that would look like. I only saw them interact once. We did see Brittany, his daughter, was visibly emotional at times. She was tearing up. It looked like she was trying to avoid eye contact with some of the folks in the courtroom. But I only noticed them address each other once. I noticed Richard Allen kind of nod at her. She kind of gave him a half smile and immediately teared up. That was the only time I witnessed an exchange between those two.
That's all that I saw too. And notable, and not sure what necessarily to make of it, but his daughter has not been in court since the kind of the very beginning. And she does have a young child. She's expecting another. So obviously this whole trial and all these proceedings would put an incredible amount of stress on her, which could easily, so we're not going to look into the fact that she wasn't there. Another thing to point out that we may not have mentioned so far is Kathy Allen, Richard's wife, and his mother, they have missed a fair amount of testimony over the last few days. The explanation for his mom not being there last Saturday, so actually about a week ago, she fell and tripped on her way going into the Carroll County Courthouse, and she actually broke her nose. So she's been home recovering from that. And Kathy Allen has not wanted to be in court for some of the really challenging testimony. She was in court to listen to some of the phone calls, the confessions. As far as seeing the video of her husband in prison, she has chosen not to be there to see that video.
Yeah, and one other thing I think is important to mention before we move on to our next witness, the jurors in this trial have asked really great questions.
Fabulous questions.
They've been very involved from what we can tell. They've asked a lot of questions, and one of the jurors asked an interesting question of Brittany, his daughter. The juror wrote, did you visit the High Bridge in your teens? During cross-examination, the state then asked, okay, did you go to the High Bridge with your father? She said yes. They asked another question. They said, were you scared when you went and visited the High Bridge with your father? She said, of the bridge, yes, meaning scared of the bridge, yes. They kind of danced around that topic a couple times. She ended up saying that she had gone to the bridge with her father maybe once or twice, in her words, as she was a teenager. But growing up here in Delphi, we understand that's a common occurrence, and that's what kids do. And so she said, yeah, of course I've been there. But just an interesting
I thought it was interesting also. I thought it was a great question from the juror. And by the way, juror sitting in seat number 5, man, if there's an opportunity to be able to ask questions, she's asking.
Yeah.
I mean, she is just sending those questions to the judge to ask the jurors on almost every witness. She's a very inquisitive, curious juror, and she's had some really good questions. I thought it was a really good follow-up question by Deputy Prosecutor Jim Luttrell, who not only then, after saying, did you visit the High Bridge in your teens, he specifically said, did you go there with your father, getting her to say, yeah, we used to go there, perhaps establishing the fact that Richard Allen is very comfortable and familiar with going out onto that bridge, which a lot of people have described as super scary.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's move on to our next witness. It was Shelby Hicks, and we probably don't have to chat about her for very long. I didn't think her testimony was particularly memorable. She and her boyfriend were on the Monon High Bridge. It sounds like just before the time that the murders happened. And she explained to the jury what she saw. She got a bunch of questions from the defense. She got a fair number of questions on cross-examination too. I didn't necessarily see anything huge that came away from that testimony that hasn't already been discussed by other folks who've provided testimony to the jury.
I would agree, and I was surprised by that because, like you mentioned, this was much longer than what we heard from Richard Allen's own family even. It took a lot more time, but again, yeah, she said, my boyfriend and I were there that day. It was a beautiful day. We were there for less than 30 minutes is what they decided today in court, and she said, we saw some people out and about. The next day, once we heard the news of what had happened, we decided to go to police and at least just share what we saw while we were out there. She said, we talked to police twice and we haven't heard from them since. So I was almost waiting for more to come out of that.
Yeah.
But that was kind of the extent of that.
Someone else who was at the scene that day, not exactly clear what the defense was trying to get to by putting Shelby Hicks on the stand.
Yeah.
But that was her testimony. And then really tense interaction between the defense and Steve Mullen back on the stand again, one of the main investigators in this entire case for the prosecutor, and that exchange was really testy between Andrew Baldwin and Steve Mullen.
Yeah, you can tell that Investigator Mullen had been on the stand before and knows his stuff, right? Andrew Baldwin would ask a question, or the defense would ask a question, and he would say, is there a question there? What's the point? What are we getting at here? So very much holding his ground, but a lot of the focus here was talking about the vehicles of this case. Talk to me about that.
Yes. So earlier, and again, this all originated from a question from the jury asking, do we know how many of these 2014 Ford Focus hatchbacks were in the area of Delphi, were registered by the state. Again, that's the type of car that Richard Allen has, that he said that he was driving, and that investigators told the jury that they think they see driving along a road just north of the crime scene, right around the time of the crime scene, or I should say just before, kind of putting him in that location. And the jury had asked, how many of these types of cars are there in the area? Would it be unusual that you would have a Ford Focus 2014 hatchback in that area? So it was a few days later that Steve Mullen came back to give the jury an answer to that, and he said it was a relatively small number of vehicles that fit that description. Well, today, Andrew Baldwin really took him to task for that, said that he was selectively presenting information to the jury because it kind of came out today in Steve Mullen's testimony that he very selectively chose a very small number of hatchback models for the 2014 Ford Focus, when in fact there are actually many more models of that hatchback that would look similar to what Richard Allen was driving that day. And so he was really trying to impeach the witness and suggest that you're not telling the jury the whole story here. You picked and chose what information you presented to them, and there's actually a much larger pool of vehicles in the 5-county area right around Delphi that you should have told them that you didn't.
Well, in fact, he even asked, Andrew Baldwin specifically asked, don't you think it would be important for the jury to see similar models? Looking back, don't you think this would be important? To which he responded, it would be, yes. So again, it kind of caught him in one of these moments of, was there more that could have been done here?
Right, and then there was the part about the log of missing interviews, and he was trying to essentially catch Steve Mullen in a lie to the jury there. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, this kind of goes back to testimony that was made back in March of this year from this investigator. Andrew Baldwin brought up missing evidence again today. And he said, was there a log created of these missing interviews or even interviews without sound that were allegedly captured? And he said, yeah, there were. We tried to document all that. And then they said, well, hang on. That's not what you told us a few months ago. Again, trying to backtrack on what's actually the case here. And then so Andrew Baldwin specifically asked, so was there a log or not? And he said, Andrew Baldwin said, so there is no log. And Mullen said, no, that's not correct. He said, I may have said that at one point, but I've learned more information. Since then, again, it was this back and forth and kind of a heated exchange between this investigator and the defense.
And then he followed up with that because there were certain interviews that very early on in the days right after the investigation started, when the girls' bodies were found, some interviews that were done with what the defense says were some possible key suspects that ended up, according to the state, being accidentally erased. And there were some interviews that were erased, and then there were other interviews that just didn't have the audio, or the audio was missing on them. And he followed up, Andrew Baldwin followed up with Investigator Mullen to say, well, what about, you had told us that you had also cataloged and logged all the interviews that had missing audio, and you told us that you had done that, but does that actually exist? And Steve Mullen basically said, no, we didn't, which was different than his testimony previously. So again, trying to undercut the credibility of that witness who presented some important testimony earlier in the trial to the jury.
And then there was this topic about the van, right?
Yes.
We've heard about this van before. It was brought up, was it last week?
Yes.
In some of Richard Allen's talks about how there was a van that scared him at the crime scene, during one of these alleged confessions in prison. That van was brought up again today.
Yeah, it was. And the state says that Richard Allen confessing to Dr. Walla and including in his confession to Dr. Walla about that van, that's the first time that anyone had ever heard about this van, and that's the one piece that basically ties Richard Allen to knowing information that no one else would know, that was never released before. Well, today, Andrew Baldwin asked Steve Mullen, hey, did you ever see online on Reddit and on all these chat forums lots of discussion about a white van out there? And we know that Dr. Walla admitted she's a huge true crime fan. She said that she followed these podcasts and followed these Reddit chains, and that she had seen and been following the case for years, even before Richard Allen came to become one of her patients. And he asked Steve Mullen, you don't really know what Dr. Walla may have talked to Richard Allen about before those confessions. Maybe she had talked about this white van that she might have read about online, and that he might have learned about the van that way. And Steve Mullen acknowledged, no, he did not know everything that Dr. Walla had discussed with Richard Allen. So that kind of throws that piece of testimony by Dr. Walla and that contention by the state that this proves that he wouldn't possibly, know about this unless he were the killer, that throws that piece a little bit into question.
Yeah, and Andrew Baldwin asked too, he said, so you're telling me you never heard or saw any social media posts or discussions talking about this white van between 2017 and 2022, to which he pretty much answered no. And then Andrew Baldwin said, well, will you be surprised if I tell you there are dozens? What about the complaint about the white van that did this? What about the complaint about a white van here? At this point, the state, right, starts interjecting, starts getting involved. But again, going back to that conversation of was there more that could have or should have been done at that time?
Yeah. So Scott, today, again, really the defense trying to undermine the credibility of testimony that has come before from the state, from their psychologists, from their investigators. The defense is trying to be very deliberate about going after some of that testimony.
All right, Bob and Sam, we'll get back to you in just a moment. Let's bring Katie back into the conversation and ask you about Steve Mullen, this former Delphi police chief who's now this investigator for the Carroll County prosecutor. He's been on the witness stand a few times in this case. What is the jury to make of a repeat witness coming back in?
Well, if he's coming back in as a state's witness, there's not always a lot to make of that because they may need to recall him a couple of times to lay evidentiary foundations. But now that he's come twice as a defense witness, I said previously, it wasn't a good look for him to ever be called by the defense. Now he's been called twice and he has been confronted with inconsistent statements. And again, we have to remember, he was the police chief. So he was a lead investigator on this case. So to think that he's concealing things from the jury that has to be brought out by the defense, and then to learn that he's making inconsistent statements, that is just not good for the state in any way.
Right. Let's also talk about the jurors asking the question of the two family members of Richard Allen. So we've heard from Bob and Sam that both Richard Allen's sister and Richard Allen's daughter were witnesses today. What do you make about the jurors asking the question, hey, have you ever been to the High Bridge before with your father? Why do you think the jurors were interested in learning that?
Well, I think we have to assume that they wanted to understand more about Richard Allen's familiarity with the bridge. We've heard a lot of testimony about how this is sort of a rite of passage for people in the community. And I think it's probably exactly what Bob and Sam said. They were trying to get an idea for how comfortable he was with the bridge, how comfortable he was with that whole area, and how familiar with it he was.
Okay, what do you make about the line of questioning from the defense asking about, did Richard Allen ever touch you? Did he ever molest you? Do you still love him? Would you ever lie for him? What do you make of that line of questioning?
I think this was masterful trial strategy for a couple of reasons. So first, we have to look at their line of questioning of Dr. Westcott about Richard Allen making false statements. If you recall, we got some notes about how when she was cross-examined about how did you determine he was making false statements, she said, well, for starters, he said the devil committed these crimes, and that's not true, right? And so the jury is left with that evidence. And then the defense, right after that, puts on the first family member that he said he allegedly molested, which was his sister. And she gets on the stand and says, well, that's not true. And then you hear from his daughter, who gets on the stand and says, well, that wasn't true. And so this was really masterful strategically, because the defense very much could have said the jury should not be able to hear that Richard Allen confessed to molestation.
Right.
That's another crime, and that's prohibited by the rules of evidence. But as a matter of strategy, they let that information in. And that could have been really bad for Richard Allen, for this jury to hear him say that he's a child molester.
Right.
But they knew that strategically that was powerful, because they knew that they were able to refute that and to say it just wasn't true. So to now put these witnesses on the stand to say, this is nonsensical, these things never happened, it completely highlights their position that he was just making things up that simply were not true.
Okay, so now I want to go back to Bob and Sam, because we were talking on Friday about this neighbor who lives down near this crime scene, near the bridge, and this is a man that is back on the witness stand. Tell us about this Brad Weber that testified today.
Yeah, that's right. Brad Weber lives at a property that's right next to this crime scene, essentially. In fact, today in court, he told the jury that one of the driveways to his property runs right underneath the Monon High Bridge. So his property is right there. And what was so important about today was the fact that the defense got him to admit that he had told differing stories about what he did that day, the day the girls went missing, after work. At one point, he said he went straight home for work, which would have put him there at the time the girls went missing. And then another time, he said that, no, I didn't go straight home. I went and worked on a side job, then went home later in the day. Two different stories, of course, from this man, Brad Weber. again, why that's important, the timing of this case, and the white van comes up again, because if he did go home straight from work, then that puts him there at the time the girls went missing.
Yeah, let's talk about that timeline
Yeah.
a little bit. And this is, again, a witness that the state called to talk about the timeline that they are trying to show. To backtrack a little bit again, Richard Allen, in his confessions to Dr. Walla, one of the things that he mentioned is he told the girls to go down the hill and then he planned to sexually assault them, but he didn't follow through with that because he saw a van that scared him and changed his plans. And the state called Brad Weber. They put together this timeline to tell the jury that we think that van that scared Richard Allen, again, crucial piece of information that only the killer would know, that the person in that van was Brad Weber. So let's put up the timeline here of what we know happened that day that the state laid out. At 2:02, Brad Weber said that he clocked out at the Subaru plant in Lafayette, and at 2:13, Libby recorded Bridge Guy on the Monon High Bridge, and then at 2:32, Libby's phone data from the Apple Health app on her phone shows that the phone stopped moving. So they believe right around there, or before 2:32 is when the murders happened. And then to backtrack a little bit, they say that it was about 25 or so minutes for Brad Weber to get home, so that if he went straight home, 2:27 to 2:30 would be the time that he returned home, said he was driving his van that day, and that could certainly corroborate, potentially, the story that Richard Allen told, that if there was a van on that access road, and that access road is the driveway leading to Brad Weber's home, that could help corroborate their story. But, like Sam just mentioned, the defense pulled up 2 interviews from right after the murders took place. And Brad Weber said today he talked to police almost constantly after these murders happened. They stopped him, they searched his car, they did a search warrant on his home, they checked and did a search warrant on his gun that he had at his home. What they focused in on was on February 17th of 2017, which would be 3 days after the girls' bodies were found. He told some officers that he went straight home that day, but 2 days after that, when he was interviewed by an FBI agent, he told that agent that he did not go straight home that day, that he checked ATM machines and then went home. And Brad Weber explained to the jury today that he owns, back at the time, he owned about 35 ATM machines. He was responsible for making sure that the machines had enough money in them and that they had paper to print out receipts. So again, the defense today trying to impeach this witness, trying to show difference in his story that would call into question whether or not this time frame really fit what the state is trying to say fits the narrative of the murders.
And again, the jurors asking really important, detailed questions. Another one asking this time, is it typical for you to go home after you would clock out at Subaru, go home, then go out and check on these ATM machines? And he said, no.
He said no, it's not, which was, again, a great question by the jury, and could cause the jury to have some doubt about whether or not Brad Weber's story is correct and whether or not this theory that is laid out by the state is correct as well.
There's a lot to get to. And there was a lot to break down today. Tomorrow is Election Day.
Yes.
But this judge has been very adamant that we're going to wrap up this trial in her allotted time. So we'll be in court tomorrow. We are expecting another full day, especially as we near the end of the defense's arguments here.
Day 16 coming up tomorrow, and we think that there could be just a couple more days of testimony before this could go to the jury, before they get closing arguments and instructions and then start deliberating and come through with a verdict. So lot to report here on day 15. Scott and Katie, we will send it back to you, and as we have been every day of this trial, back in court again tomorrow. We'll see you tomorrow night.
All right, Bob and Samantha doing an excellent job. Again, Cameras are not allowed inside, but our reporters are, and they're doing a terrific job giving us comprehensive coverage of testimony that happens there in Carroll County. Thanks to you both. We'll see you tomorrow. Let's bring Katie back in and find out the significance of Brad Weber's testimony today and the questions that not only the defense was asking about his timing of leaving the Subaru job. Did you come home? Did you go to this side job to work on ATMs? And the jurors asking the question as well.
So I think to really understand the strategy behind that line of questioning and that testimony from Weber today, you have to take it along with Mullen's testimony. So there was a lot put into questioning Mullen about this whole situation with this van. So last week when we heard Richard Allen confess and included this detail about the van, that was a big moment for the state because only the killer would know that. That really tipped the scales towards the state in terms of the evidence. And so now what we saw was that first they put Mullen on and they said, wait a minute, this isn't some big secret that only the killer would know. There are theories all over the internet about this van. So that really, really undercut that evidence and took a little bit of the wind out of the state's sails as to that fact. And then they followed that up immediately with this testimony from Brad Weber that suggested that he can't even be sure that he actually was one driving his van that day and would have been there at that time. And so again, I think strategically they've done a masterful job of simply casting doubt on that fact as to whether or not that was just some smoking gun and some fact that only the true killer would have known about. And that's a big deal in terms of refuting that piece of the state's evidence, because we have to remember the burden is proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So even if they can't conclusively prove that Brad Weber wasn't out there, just casting that doubt on a big piece of the state's evidence is really effective.
All right, Katie Jackson-Lindsay has been with us every day giving us really solid legal analysis because she's been a deputy prosecutor, she is a criminal defense attorney, she knows her stuff, and I appreciate you being here again. Want to let you know that we break down the Delphi murders trial every weeknight at 10 o'clock here on WTHR Plus. Want to let you know, though, we will not be doing this show on election night. We're going to be doing election coverage on Tuesday, but you can see all of our coverage, including detailed reports on each day of this trial by going to WTHR.com/Delphi. Thanks for joining us.